Hey people, beautiful people, welcome back to my channel. And specifically, welcome back to my Myers-Briggs Marathon, day 3. We're gonna finally get into our first spectrum and our first two letters, I and E, which stand for introverted, extroverted. What's interesting about these two letters is that they represent words that we use in everyday conversation, and we already have a lot of pre-existing associations with, which very often gets us into trouble and makes us clock other people incorrectly and clock ourselves incorrectly. A lot of times we think introvert means shy, rude, unapproachable, weird. It doesn't. We also think extroverted means warm, charming, generous, outgoing, approachable. It doesn't. It definitely doesn't. In this video, I'm gonna explain introversion, I'm gonna explain extroversion, and I'm gonna give you some of the questions that I ask and the things that I'm looking for when I'm really trying to clock someone as an introvert or an extrovert, really trying to figure out what letter is tattooed on their soul as opposed to just pinned on their shirt, you know? As I mentioned in the last video, the test looks at our current behavior, not the truth of who we are underneath all the layers of things that pull us away from our core operating system. It looks at how we behave now, and it doesn't take things like trauma or culture or family context, school context, home context, authority, expectations. It doesn't take any of those things into consideration. So yeah, let's get right on it.
Get right on it.
As I said in previous videos, this is all about a spectrum. No one is 100% either introvert or extrovert. You have introverted behaviors and tendencies and extroverted behaviors and tendencies in you. Everyone does. It takes different things to trigger them, and they're in us in different quantities, but Myers-Briggs does draw a line down the middle of the spectrum and assign you a letter based on which side you fall on most. I want to start by saying that a lot of times when people end up talking about or learning about Myers-Briggs, they're really quick to want to be a well-rounded human and just put an X right in the center and say, I do both very well. We definitely don't care that you're well-rounded, Susan. You don't get points for being well-rounded here. You get points for adhering to reality. Now, the internet invented a word for people who believe that they fall right in the middle, and it's called an ambivert, and I hate that word just as much as I hate the test. I am gonna do a separate video on why you think you're an ambivert and why you're not, and why I don't believe in ambiverts at all. Instead of believing in ambiverts, I believe in what I call an energy equation. That's a Halle term, not a Myers-Briggs term, but when I say your energy equation, I'm trying to honor the fact that you're a complex character, and I'm trying to honor the fact that it's never going to be as simple as A plus B equals exhausted or A plus B equals energized. This is a complex equation of a lot of factors that are always going to be ever-changing and ever-evolving as life happens to you and you happen to life. As you collect traumatic experiences, or as you collect healing around those traumatic experiences, what energizes and exhausts you is going to change. As you come up under new authority or you regain some autonomy, what energizes and exhausts you is going to change. Based on the amount of ignorance that you carry versus the amount of insight that you carry, what energizes and exhausts you is going to change. There are a lot of factors at play here, and this will forever be a complex equation. We're doing people a big injustice by letting them just draw an X in the middle of the spectrum and saying, I'm both, I'm an ambivert.
No!
What's most important here is that we get down to the bottom of what letter is tattooed on your soul. And in order to do that, we're gonna have to stop asking questions the way the test asks the questions. We're gonna have to stop saying,
Do you like people or do you hate them? Are you reading a book tonight or are you going to a party? Ew. When you go to parties, do you stand in the center of the room where everyone's playing beer pong and getting wasted? Or do you stand in the corner wearing your antisocial social club hoodie being miserable and unapproachable?
we need to stop asking questions like that. I'm gonna share with you some of the questions that I use to really get down to the nitty-gritty and help me clock people correctly and help me figure out what letter is tattooed on their soul. And I'm not really gonna facilitate an actual test for you right now because I'm working on rewriting a test, but I am gonna give you a general idea of what introvert and extrovert means and some of the questions you can use to dig deeper. An extrovert is basically described as someone who prefers high energy settings, a lot of social interaction, and a relatively consistent proximity to other people. The opportunity to interact with people and connect with people energizes them. It is a sustainable source of energy for them, and they like it that way. If they were to think of themselves as a battery, social interaction would be required for recharge, and a lack of social interaction is what would exhaust the juice from their battery. For extroverts, spending too much time alone or spending too long in a very low energy setting can have an exhausting effect on them. For introverts, we're looking at the opposite. Social interaction, especially in high volumes and high energy settings, does not have an energizing effect on introverts. It is inherently exhausting to them. It will exhaust the energy right out of their battery necessary and what would be required for recharge is silence, solitude, and a low energy setting, completely alone or with one or very few people who do not interrupt the vibe, raise the energy, none of that. After hearing the definitions of introvert or extrovert, some people say, oh, I definitely know what I am. Yeah, but some people are like, oh, I'm both, or some people say, I really don't know. There are some questions or concepts that I use to address that confusion, so I'm going to share them with you. The first one is identifying yourself as either an internal or an external processor. When you have unanswered questions or a lack of clarity, how do you end up finding clarity? For internal processors, they will find their answers and their clarity in their thoughts. For external processors, they'll find their answers and their clarity in their words. For an internal processor, which is aligned with introversion, that means they're spending a lot of time thinking. It's not to say they're thinking nice thoughts or mean thoughts, productive thoughts or unproductive thoughts, but when they find their clarity, it's because they found it in their thoughts. One internal processor that is a friend of mine, for example, is a poet. She writes a lot of poetry, and some people will say to me, well, isn't that her finding her answers in her words? No, she found her answers within the walls of a world that only she lives in. Then you look at external processors, which is associated with extroverts. They find their answers in their words. What this normally means is they solve problems next to or proximate to someone else. They may be typing long public Facebook messages. They may be sharing the same drama with 15 different people on 15 different phone calls, or they may just be recording voice memos on their phone because their clarity requires them to speak out loud. They will find their answers in their words, outside of themselves, in conversation with an external force. There is a difference between I find my clarity in my thoughts and I actually find my clarity in my words but have no one to talk to. There is a difference between those. So if you are someone who's saying I find my clarity in my words but have no one to talk to, and that's why I chose thoughts, you would score extroverted on this one. There's also a difference between I find my clarity in my words but have so many nosy, aggressive, or just over-caring people in my life who push me to talk before I ever get a chance to think. Those are different too, and if that resonates with you, you would score an introvert even if you're always in conversation with people about your problems. The next concept that I bring up to help ease the confusion and peel back the layers is to establish this idea that there is a world inside of you, a world outside of you, and you spend a certain amount of time in each one. And I ask people which world they spend more time in and why. What is it that makes you spend time there? Is it preference? Is it expectation? Is it trauma? I also ask them where they wish they could spend all their time. To take a 16-hour day, assuming they sleep their 8 hours, and tell me how many hours a day you would want to spend in the world inside of you and how many you would want to spend in the world outside of you. And see, this doesn't help us because we figure out their current day behavior. It helps us figure out how they feel about why they behave that way and normally reveal some of the layers that we're looking for. What this also tends to reveal is a secret motivation, specifically on behalf of extroverts who wish that they were more self-aware and reflective than they are. A lot of extroverts struggle with self-awareness and with introspection. Very often they'll project an insecurity around that onto a question like this. You'll start to hear in your own answers or in their answers all the ways that they spend their time in the world inside of themselves, but there is definitely evidence that it is performative or that there is some pressure to do that rather than preference to do that. And you know, as we get older in life or we collect wisdom in life, we tend to have a stronger internal dialogue. We have a more peaceful relationship with ourselves. We're willing to spend more time and happy to spend more time in the world inside of us. And that does not mean that if you now like yourself and you haven't for 25 years that you're magically an introvert. That does not mean that. You can be an extrovert who now really loves yourself and wants to spend a lot of time developing as a person and spending time alone. You can. It's still absolutely critical that we don't forget what letter is tattooed on your soul. Another question that I ask people is about the work that they would do in the world, their best work that they can imagine. I ask them to describe that work to me and specifically the impact that it would have on people and what people. One thing you will tend to see true introverts do is talk about a depth of impact, where something you'll tend to see true extroverts do is talk about a breadth of impact. The reason we ask open-ended questions like that is because we don't want extroverts, for example, to hear a word like deep associated with introverted work and then say, oh yeah, that's the one I want. We want to kind of catch people in the trap. Extroverts tend to describe an impact on a wide body of people, many of which they'll never have personal relationships with and many of which they'll never know. Introverts tend to describe their ideal impact in a very intimate and deep way. One of the best things, honestly, that we can do is talk about an ideal world. We don't live in an ideal world where we each have control over time, space, and all our fellow humans, but it's really helpful to consider how we would behave and what choices we would make if we did have all of that control. If the skies eyes opened up and the universe said to you, you are in full control of time and space and all humans, and humans will now only have the effect on you that you want them to have. No one will annoy you, no one will exhaust you, they will love you, they won't judge you, they will be exactly what you need them to be. Now you have two options. Would you rather at the snap of a finger be promised access to all your favorite people, or would you rather at the snap of a finger be promised access to solitude? You will get both. You know, you will live your life, you will get your solitude and your favorite people, but whichever one you choose, you connect to the snap of a finger, and whenever you do that, you get access to it right away. Rain or shine, day or night, you always have access to that thing. True introverts are going to choose access to solitude. They're going to choose access to an uninterrupted vacation into the world inside of them. True extroverts are going to choose access to their favorite people. The fact of the matter is, we have so many people in the world who are hurt, who are engaging in toxic behaviors. There are exhausting people in everyone's life. So many people do have an exhausting effect on true extroverts, and that really clouds the introversion extroversion question. So one way to get through that barrier is to really just look at this as an ideal world and say, if you had all control and people only affected you the way that you wanted them to, would you want access to them more than you want access to solitude? The other thing that can really help us clock ourselves is to look for what I call the pre-trauma time period. I do want to acknowledge that I know some people do not have the privilege of having a pre-trauma time period. Some people were born into trauma and chaos and have forever existed in that. If you are self-identifying as someone who has that experience, I first just want to tell you that I love you and I care about you. And I second want to tell you not to worry, because we can still get this all figured out. What I would encourage you to do is to try to pinpoint the chapter in your life where your trauma had the least amount of hold on you, where you felt the most freedom to exist independent of your trauma. And this is where I say it's really important that we don't just look at our current behaviors, we look at our entire lives and we try to understand the patterns here. So my suggestion would be, get a piece of paper, you write down your current age, mine is 26, and then underneath it, going down the side of the page, you subtract 5, subtract 5, subtract 5, and have all of your ages every 5 years. And then I would go back and listen to the questions that I just asked. And for each of those questions that I asked, ask it of yourself at that particular age and put an E or an I, and do that all the way through with all the questions I asked and all the ages you have listed. You'll have a bunch of letters all over your paper, a combination of E's and I's, potentially all E's or potentially all I's, but normally we can start to see some patterns in there. What we want to do is then pinpoint specific letters at specific ages and ask, why was that the case? If we can circle one and say, I know, for example, that I spent more time inside the world inside of me when I was 7 because I lived in an abusive household where I was better off invisible, we can circle that letter, mark it as trauma, and understand that as one of the layers of bullshit that we need to look beneath. This is where we start to be able to peel back all those layers. We look through this long list of my answers, the E's and I's that I gave myself, and I start asking why about each of them. Some of them I can explain through the lens of trauma, some of them I can explain through a lens of culture, some of them I can explain through a lens of expectations from my school or my parents or my jobs or whatever. And we try to explain as many of them as we can, and the patterns that we can, and the ones that we can't name and explain and don't seem to have an explanation. The explanation is that they're your natural tendencies underneath all of it. The explanation is that's the letter tattooed on your soul. But we have to look at the bigger picture here, and we have to look for patterns. I mean, when I do this myself, I mark out all my ages, I answer these questions and have a map of E's and I's. I have an abundance of one of the same letters from the time that I'm 6 to 21. And then when I look at 26 is where I start to see some variation, and I see the other letter creeping in there in large quantities. And I have to ask myself why that's happening, and I can identify some of those as personal growth, but most of them as trauma. But when I take away the letters that I got in the first place through trauma, and I take away the letters that I got through maturing, and I take away the letters that I got through all these different avenues and just look at what was always there, my letter is very clear to me and I know what's tattooed on my soul. But I would love if you would guess in the comments. It is getting dark where I live, so I'm gonna have to go because I don't have a ring light. Thank you for coming to class today. Tomorrow we're going to talk about 2 more letters, feeling and thinking. I am purposely skipping intuition sensing. It is the hardest one to figure out, and we're gonna do it at the end. Thanks for tuning in. Like, comment, subscribe, share this with your other Myers-Briggs obsessed friends. Class dismissed. See you tomorrow.